I am Laura Ingraham.
Have a good night.
And we will solve this mystery tomorrow. I'm Laura Ingraham. This is Ingraham from Washington tonight. The China apologist. That's the focus of tonight's angle. All right, just in time for the Thanksgiving holiday. It was supposed to make us all feel kind of warm and fuzzy inside. Biden was working his magic once again.
Easing tensions, President Biden and Xi cover a range of issues during a 3-hour meeting in Bali.
It did give President Xi an opportunity to talk more about his meeting with Biden, which did raise hopes that there was going to be some sort of a thaw in U.S.-China relations.
Both leaders in their opening remarks expressed the need to find common ground, to find things they could work on. And
common ground? Now, why would the White House grovel for a dialogue with Xi? He's a man engaged in a nonstop campaign of domestic terror against any dissenters. And why would Biden's team seek to normalize relations with a brutal tyrant who hates everything, and I mean everything, that we stand for? Now, the fact is, China doesn't have to invade the United States to subdue and change us. It already has. It has enormous influence on our lives here through the powerful people and institutions it's bought off, to the strategic acquisitions it's made, to the technology it's stolen, to the deadly drugs it's sent here. As long as it's run by the CCP, China is our enemy, period. But not according to so many of our elites in politics and academia, entertainment, and business. In fact, many in our billionaire class spend their days making excuses for the CCP, even apologizing for the most muted Western criticism. Like Michael Bloomberg, who famously claimed that Xi was not a dictator at all, and that Xi listens to his people. Then last week, Bloomberg apologized to China when former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson called the CCP a coercive autocracy. Those are pretty bland words, if you ask me. So how sick is it that Bloomberg, who actually sits on a U.S. government defense advisory board, is defending a dictatorship against the true words of an ally? Now, I've said this before, but we feel terrible for the innocent people of China. We don't blame them. Look at what they're enduring right now, bravely protesting the horrific COVID lockdowns that are just being used to manipulate the population of China. There was an explosion of rage and fury this weekend. How could we ever cooperate and compromise with this type of country? Now, we shouldn't be looking for an armed conflict with China. I'm not saying that. But we also need to stop fooling ourselves that, like, Russia is more dangerous than Beijing in any way, shape, or form. It is not. And we need to be realistic about the severe peril that we'll face as long as Xi is in charge. He doesn't distinguish between red and blue states. He has utter contempt for all Americans, and his ultimate goal is world domination. Of course, China's apologists and enablers, they don't give a rip. Take Apple, for example. Now, this is the same company whose CEO was quick to embrace the whole systemic racism narrative that persisted in the summer of 2020.
I want to address the topic of racism, inequality, and injustice, and to recognize the pain being felt throughout our nation, especially in our Black and brown communities after the senseless killing of George Floyd. This country was founded on the principles of freedom and equality for all. For too many people and for too long, we haven't lived up to those ideals. We're inspired and moved by the passionate people around our nation and around the world who have stood up to demand change.
Why isn't Tim inspired and moved by all the passionate people in China tonight? Because they're actually putting their lives at risk by standing up for basic human rights. But rather than standing up to this sadistic regime in China, Apple's collaborating with it by working with China's secret police to clamp down on dissent during the ongoing COVID protests. They're doing this by agreeing to block the use of its file-sharing feature. Like all the other big tech CEOs, Cook has no moral qualms about making billions off the oppression of others. Half of the world's iPhones are now made in China. Now, Elon Musk, he's no better, sadly. Sad to report that. He has a big manufacturing facility for Tesla there. But we're going to see how happy Elon is when China begins exporting more of its own EVs than Tesla does. Now, the fact is, like so many lies told about China by corrupt forces here, we now see that technology has not made China freer. It's simply made the dictatorship there more efficient in its crackdowns. But the judges on the Supreme Court of globalism, they're oblivious.
We have to define how the world should look like, which we want to come out of this transformation period. I respect China's achievements, which are tremendous over the last over 40 years. I think it's a role model for many countries.
A role model for many countries. Now, we know Klaus Schwab would sell out his own mother for power and access to the Chinese markets. And our so-called allies in Europe, they're no better. The best NATO can do is call China a challenge, thanks. Italy is cozying up to the CCP on trade now. Hungary is looking to Xi for cash. And after covering up the origins of its virus that killed millions across the globe, after indirectly funding Russia's war in Ukraine, China's going to be rewarded with visits from the EU president in a few days, with French President Macron following soon after. Clearly, we stand alone against China on the international stage, but I think we should at least have a kind of a strong response to China domestically, right? Well, this is how the White House responded to the mass protests in China. And the leader of the free world is just as bad. Biden's NSC spokesperson said that zero COVID wasn't a policy we're pursuing here. They could if they would. And that it would be very difficult for China to keep the strategy going. Big deal. The Biden team, though, went from criticism that was kind of muted to something that was just plain pathetic.
What is the president's reaction when he hears protesters in China chant freedom or Xi Jinping step down?
The president's not going to speak for protesters around the world. They're speaking for themselves.
And so there's no reaction?
These protesters are speaking for themselves.
Compare that response with Biden's reaction to other protests.
It's a wake-up call to our nation. We won't let those who see this as an opportunity to sow chaos throw up a smokescreen to distract us from very real and legitimate grievances at the heart of these protests. We can't leave this moment thinking that we can once again turn away and do nothing.
Of course, the George Floyd protests. Do the protesters in China not have real, legitimate grievances? Xi is a vicious, cruel, murderous dictator. He's going to go down as one of the most destructive people in the history of the world. And if you had a chance to stand up to him and you didn't take it because you thought you could get more NBA merchandise on the shelf or do some more IPOs over there, then that is shameful. Or if you're a lawyer or you're a lobbyist and you work for these people because you want to pay your mortgage that way or just your vacations, then it's just as bad. Blood money, all of it. As long as Xi leads China, it will remain the single greatest threat to our freedom and our stability. We have to do everything in our power right now to decouple, to bring home U.S. manufacturing, and stop funding their military buildup. And by the way, also their dangerous medical research, which still goes on. We don't want another American killed by Chinese drugs. We don't want another American worker to lose his job or his company to unfair Chinese trade practices. We don't want one more American student to lose his or her slot at one of our universities. This must end. There can be no equivocation or apologizing as we defend our freedom, our independence, and our way of life. And that's the angle.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.